So I point you to the handout so you can read the full poem from Gerard, Manley, Hopkins. I'm just going to summarize a few lines in the interest of time to open this talk. Gerard, Manley, Hopkins' God's grandeur presents us a stark contrast between the shining, radiant glory of divine grandeur and the mundane, tired efforts of human existence. His language: generations have trod, all is seared, bleared, smeared, puts the freshness of deep down things and the warmth and light of bright wings all the more clearly before our eyes. If we but look, we will find beauty, and beauty will draw us to God. Look up, enjoins Hopkins. Look out and find God's grandeur. Hopkins is not alone in employing aesthetics as a meaningful mode of Catholic discourse. For over 70 years, academics in theology have engaged a steady recovery project in the field of theological aesthetics. In modern theology, no one surpasses Hans Urs von Balthasar and his 7-volume Theological Aesthetics, Glory of the Lord. Yeah, I see that smile. His masterful exploration weaves Old and New Testaments, Catholic and Protestant traditions, ancient and modern philosophy, and a crazy diverse range of literary figures together in a dialogue in order to address the specific issue of beauty as a theological resource. Until the 20th century, though, beauty was very much the ugly duckling of the transcendental tradition, reluctantly born into the present from the classical religious thought of the Middle Ages. Reluctantly should be emphasized. It barely qualified as a distinct and significant element for discussions about unity, goodness, and truth. Even further, beauty received a significant downgrade in status in a post-Enlightenment and in particular a post-Kantian world where its standing eroded to a matter of subjective, experiential encounter rather than an objective measure of thought. For Balthasar to recognize that this formerly last word ought to be first was and still is a dramatic declaration for what has been forgotten and cast aside. Balthasar's championing and elevation of beauty certainly accomplished its goal in theological circles at least, inscribing beauty as a prominent word for the tradition, which has only grown in the work of Hans Küng, John Milbank, Graham Ward, and David Bentley Hart. Milbank traces the path of subjective encounter with the infinite depth of objectivity. Hart turns our steps towards beauty infinity as a reflection of divine radiance. Küng presses us to see classical art as a sign of God. These thinkers share a common belief that beauty, be that of the natural world or created art, offers a word of hope and an attractive invitation. Recognizing the significance and power of this transcendental, Balthasar and his successors, or contemporaries, bring beauty into the height of theology as part of the nature of God's perfection and into the heart of creaturely existence in a world made for relationship with God. Balthasar and his inheritors explore the depths of what we find in Hopkins' poem. They predicate their discussions on a sense of beauty as the mystery of form associated with the great radiance from within that creation itself manifests. Although distinct from divine glory, which can only be predicated of God, beauty resembles the divine self-perfection by virtue of the world's created being analogously reflecting God's image. Beauty then operates on an ontological level. It is a manifestation of reality that calls for recognition of and response to the splendor that appears in the created world. Okay, crazy sentence. In other words, it shows an irreducible connection between what is manifest, or the form of being as it appears in an existing things, and how being is manifest, namely through the radiance that accompanies creation. Beauty gives reality its shape, which is anything but surface deep, as well as its formal brilliance that arrests and attracts. For Balthasar and others, the truth of the world cannot be thought without beauty as a critical part of what and how created reality appears. Quick aside on metaphysics. Normally we might think of matter and form, sort of the whatness and then the way it appears. What we see in this discussion of beauty is something, I think in Balthasar, that is working on a classical and phenomenological level. That's why it's so confusing, and probably why a purely classical tradition struggled to bring it into modernity. If you want to talk more about that, come see me. If beauty is such a powerful and vital theological resource, we would do well to ask, what ways has it translated from the scholarly richness of academic work to the practical experiences of parish life? Perhaps when we think of beauty in parish life, particular memories of religious artwork, music, or liturgies come to mind. We remember a specific stained glass window from our childhood, or the song the choir sung at a Good Friday service that put us in a very particular penitential mood. We think of the medieval cathedral we once visited abroad with its grandiose proportions, or of museums filled with religious art depictions, showing familiar themes and figures through the eyes of times and cultures not our own. All these moments testify to the existence of theological aesthetics in a practical setting. They are all important. But I would like to ask, how much have such memories impacted the form of your religious habits on a daily basis? Has it created a lasting impression that sustains you in times of trial and suffering? Has it become something you can explain and use to spread the gospel message? Although beauty is everywhere in the Catholic tradition, its theological impact remains largely muted. Catholics find themselves at a strange juxtaposition of two practical problems. First, the power of beauty as a theological resource has not been translated from the academic revitalization into daily pastoral practices. Where Catholic parents concern themselves with helping their children to appreciate the moral teachings of the Church and the importance of liturgy as God's communication of grace through sacrament and community, few worry about the aesthetic education of their offspring. This is not parental negligence, but rather indicative of a broad Catholic ignorance. No one has taught parishioners to understand and mine the richness of what beauty can offer. Parish programming leaves aesthetic formation out of its biblical, moral, and evangelical efforts. Even worse, beauty often becomes a pawn in liturgical wars between traditional and contemporary factions. Either what is old is beautiful and what is new is ugly, or vice versa. The neutrality of beauty as an afterthought, on the one hand, does little, and the weaponization of it has the potential to injure and entrench division. This brings me to my second point. Much like with the students I teach, beauty for Catholics aligns with the way we as a society view beauty overall. That is to say, beauty has been reduced to subjective preference. I ask students in my class if they think there is anything objective about beauty, and I receive the resounding answer that beauty is completely a matter of personal opinion. It is fully and only in the eye of the beholder. Unless beauty trespasses into the realm of ethics, where an aesthetic representation harms an individual or the community in some way, it cannot be judged. Ironically, in a postmodern world, Kant's Concord of Reason's universal power only recognizes what it cannot do, aka it cannot make a judgment. This is not to say that students are not deeply influenced by aesthetic decisions made for and by them, from the sleek lines of iPhones, contemporary architecture, and web design, to the fashion trends that have brought back large eyewear frames, checked flannel, high-waisted jeans, and the chunky heel, some of which I like, some of which I do not. Their tastes represent an amalgam of advertisement and individual preference. The reduction of beauty to taste or preference concerns me as a Catholic and as a theologian because I know the depth of what beauty can and ought to offer the world, and I see how impoverished we have become without its presence. While taste can help in certain situations, definitely in the reduction of the noise of a technological world, which I welcome. Its palliative effect reduces the awareness we have for meaningful encounter. To be enamored with this cosmetic beauty comes at the cost of understanding and entering into beauty's true power, namely, the mediation of relationship. In the remainder of this talk, I would like to outline 3 notable areas where practical incorporations of beauty deepens individual and communal relation to God and invites all who witness it to respond to the gospel message. If we engage it, beauty fosters attention in prayer, offers sustenance in times of suffering, and supports the habit of wonder in everyday activities. As Catholics, and particularly today, we cannot afford to sideline this incredible power. Simone Weil speaks about the significance of studying geometry as something of a training in her attention, which she claims directly applies to a life of prayer. She remarks, quote, "The key to a Christian conception of studies is the realization that prayer consists of attention. It is the orientation of all the attention of which the soul is capable toward God," end quote. Weil argues in her practically oriented essay that subjects of no interest to students are particularly useful for developing this faculty of attention. Although Weil finds little to love in geometry, training herself to work through the challenges and master the precepts of this science that for her at least, and certainly for me, is uninteresting or boring, strengthens the lower attention of her mind and perseverance. It prepares her to employ a higher attention in her prayer life that depends on orienting and sustaining a single-minded focus as she enters into a relationship with God. And she notes, quote, "Warmth of heart cannot make up for it," end quote. They shifts our mentality from attention as entertainment to the idea of attention as a capacity in need of development. Like a muscle, attention needs a workout, and things that we find profoundly uninteresting can be quite useful. It is encouraging to think that nothing learned is ever wasted in expanding our ability to pray. Beauty, in some sense, fits into this idea of paying attention. It is a recognition of quality, radiance, and depth within existence that expands our mental boundaries. However, beauty is more than that. In a classical vocabulary, beauty is fundamentally disinterested because it presents an objective reality that cannot be reduced to the vacancy or need of the gazing party. What is beautiful is not beautiful simply because I must fill a void inside myself. This classical definition is misleading, though, if we take it to mean that we cannot find beauty attractive. Beauty issues an invitation to the viewer not to fill a subjective hole, but rather to offer a gift. As a gift, beauty supports attention's perseverance by reducing the burden placed on this faculty, as well as offering it the joy of encounter. When we see beauty in the world, the effort needed to pay attention reduces. Our captivation with its depth and mystery makes the work tolerable and easier than it would have been otherwise. When I teach great books, I endeavor to help my students see what is fundamentally rich and captivating in what we read. There is more than a nugget that can be distilled on Wikipedia. The form and content in the books that they are reading is integral to the stories that these books tell. The more students see and embrace the sense of intricacy or see the depths of these books' beauty, the more they approach the tasks I ask of them with ease, and the greater joy they find in relating to the material. Beauty has a similar effect in the habit of prayer. The more we see and understand the experience of beauty in prayer, the less burdensome the formation of good habits becomes, and we are able to find greater joy in the encounter. The Psalms are perhaps the easiest place to see the interactive mode of content and form as beauty, and our own hearts lift almost effortlessly with the psalmists as we pray. A little quote from Psalm 48. beautiful in its loftiness, with the joy of the whole earth, like the heights of Mount Zaphon is Mount Zion, the city of the great King. We are drawn in by these words and ascend with them to God. The more we learn to see the beauty of prayer and support it in our prayer life, be that when we rise or go to sleep, over meals, and most especially at Mass, the more readily and deeply are we able to embrace the mysterious relationship that each of us, as humble created beings, have with the Lord of the universe. To think of beauty in the way I have so far described it is probably one that we are relatively or mostly familiar with. In other works, I have articulated how and why the sense of beauty constitutes a light side of beauty's radiance. On the flip side, I have also delved into the darker sense of what beauty might mean, which, following the language of Hans Urs von Balthasar, issues from the mysterious dark radiance of Christ crucified. I would like to turn our attention to the second sense of beauty for a moment, as a way of showing the way beauty accompanies us through every moment of life, and in particular, into the heart of those moments that are most challenging. It is probably more comfortable for us to think of beauty as a kind of fair weather friend, in whose presence we revel as we enter into the natural goodness that the world offers, or as a point of consolation that supplies a permanent juxtaposition between what ought to be and the troubles we experience. Much more could be said here, but to only think of beauty this way once again shortchanges the reality of its presence and power. A former student and I recently had coffee, and with the devastated chagrin only a Notre Dame student can muster. It's true. She admitted that she was struggling to be in love with Thomas Aquinas as she thought she ought to be during her freshman year. This is really only a Notre Dame problem. Nothing stood particularly against the angelic doctor, but in light of her recent experiences with some of the hardest moments that life can throw at anyone, she felt a deep need for an encounter that resonated with the idea of dark radiance that Balthasar speaks of when he describes the cross. As Balthasar recognizes, and here he's heavily indebted to Bonaventure, Pseudo-Dionysius, and Augustine, there is something fundamentally changed in darkness by the cross's form, which then forever impacts our own experience of darknesses and of life's Good Fridays. The cross and its particular beauty offer a strange kind of attraction that is not simply reducible to the glory of the resurrection. This beauty supplies a moment of encounter not only in abundance, but also in the heart of desolation. Perhaps the most impactful contemporary articulations of this kind of beauty are found on the pages of Annie Dillard's nonfiction, which increasingly turns to a darkened imagery to express an encounter between brokenness and God. Dillard stands transfixed by the horrific beauty of a child badly burned in an accident, writing, quote, held fast by love in the world like a moth in wax, your life a wick, your head on fire with prayer, held utterly outside and in, you sleep alone, you cry God, end quote. In the sense of darkened beauty, what mirrors the lightness of consoling comfort appears in the confusion of absence and loss. It is not that beauty has ceased to be itself. It is that God invites us into relationship, even in darkness. Recognizing and developing an appreciation for this side of beauty further draws us into God's love in the moments that seem to be outside of the good and outside of the reach of consolation. Moments like the loss of a parent or a child, the horrors of a life-altering disease, or the scars created by neglect and abuse. As the Holy Cross motto states, Ave crux spes unica, the cross is profoundly beautiful, and its beauty sustains absolutely. A practical incorporation of such beauty, in the ways we prepare those who minister in times of grief, in the prayers we write for times of loss, or simply as a vocabulary for thinking through our own experiences, could deepen the support we offer in these most trying moments. In closing, I will offer one final example to round out my case for beauty as an important and practical part of church life, one with which we are particularly familiar as children, but tend to forget as we journey into adulthood. That is, the cultivation of wonder in the everyday. G.K. Chesterton once wrote, "The world will never starve for want of wonders, but only for want of wonder." Chesterton penned this line at the end of his first chapter of Tremendous Trifles after writing, here I quote again, "Satan was the most celebrated of Alpine guides. When he took Jesus to the top of an exceedingly high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of earth, the joy of Satan standing on a peak is not a joy in largeness, but a joy in beholding smallness, and the fact that all men look like insects at his feet," end quote. It is very easy today, with technological advances, to feel that we ourselves have climbed to the top of the mountain. Many conflate scientific achievement and truth as though the two were perfectly and exclusively equivalent. In this event, the world is made small before our feet. But to make the world so small is to lose the world as it is, and to lose ourselves as marvelous mysteries made to be in relation to God. The practicality of beauty is the practicality of interruption and arrest that restores the grand dimensions of the world. Beauty halts the gaze and asks a question about the depths of creation and the God who sustains it. It offers an invitation into the vast mystery that this world so desperately needs. One miracle of childhood is to see a world of possibility beyond natural limits. The more we learn to see beauty as adults, the more we are opened to that same infinity of possibility. For God's love knows no bounds, and divine infinity outstrips our wildest creativity. The question left to us is, will we have the eyes to see it? Will beauty break us free from the mundane? I very much hope so. Quote, "Because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breasts and bright wings. What wondrous possibilities await." Thank you.